tonight, nicely, we want to address an issue that is very, very important. And this issue is the artificial manipulation of the timeline. Now, it seems like science fiction. Some might try to dismiss it, the artificial manipulation, or it might not be considered totally artificial, but let's just say the manipulation of the timeline. What do we mean by this? Well, first of all, let's touch on some of the basic documentation that we're going to use as some of the jump off references, immediate references. Now, this is one book that some of you might have seen it before, and I'm sure you probably can find it out there on the internet. You probably can get a good read of it, with the different type of PDFs, scribes, other sites on the internet that probably refer to this particular book. Actually, it's a series of books. Now, as we said, just recently, we went into some of our archives, went into some of our collection, and we said, let's go check it out. Let's see what it's all about. Let's review it again. And we were pleasantly surprised with what we found in this particular document. Now, this is called The Shining Light, and it's speaking about the ETs, the secret government, alien bases, and the battle begins. Now, as we said, this book is a little bit dated, but just recently we were conducting some of our online reasonings, or rather telephone conference reasonings with some of our co-partners, and we got into some spontaneous issues, and it was interesting because Adonai had laid it on my heart and the Holy Spirit, and I began to reason on it. In fact, I have to check with them and see if they were recording that particular part of it. But I kept thinking about this particular subject matter, and it's the manipulation of the timeline. Well, now is a good, quote, time to deal with it. Now is the best time as any. So let us get into a little bit of what is contained in this particular document here. Now, first of all, there's a lot that's in here. Some of it may be considered speculative, but since this work was written or published, this was published in 1994, this particular book by Light Technology Publishing. And what we found interesting was, in addition to the subject matters covered, was the dates, some significant dates of so-called alien encounters, of questionable activities. Now, one of them, let's just use our dry erase board right here, and let us get into it, all right? So grab your pen and your paper, the sacred scripture, and bring a willing and attentive mind, and let's get into the half of the story that hasn't been revealed since our ancestors, the once lost but now found data Israel, was brought to this hemisphere, the so-called New World, into this so-called New World Order. Remember, the New World Order is actually an old reality. So the New World Order they're speaking about is still a speculative and a projective reality, and it's all about time. It's all about timing, and this is the key thing. It's all about timing. Now, first of all, we're going to put this down on the side right here, Kristen Gamadium, because we've touched on that particular issue, and we'll be returning to that particular reasoning. So let's take this off because we're about to get into the new Sabbath within about a day or so. So this is probably a good time as of any to address this particular matter. Now, what is time? Here's the key question, right? Here's the key question. what is time? What is time? Ask yourself that. How do we account for time? How do we calculate time? How do we define time? In other words, what time is it? And what is time to begin with? You see, this is a very interesting. Now, if we look at it from a European, and we live in a Gentile age, this is the particular age that we're in. We're under the times of the Gentiles. The Bible describes the present time, dispensation that we're living in, as the times of the Gentiles. So let's put down a couple of basics. First of all, before we get into some of what we have been discussing and what we think is perhaps an issue that's about time. Time. What is it? What is time? Now, we hear that we are living in the end times. What does that mean? What does the end times mean? But what does time mean? Now, of course, we got to go to our own root, our own Ethiopic root. So we're going to define things according to the Ge'ez, according to the Ethiopic. So let's go into our own Ethiopic root concerning time. We say Bamarinya. Let's do Amarinya, Bamarinya. We say Gize, Gize, Gize. You can either say it as a G, Zay, like that, or as Gi, Zay, or someone might want to write Zay, or some might want to write Zay. The fact is that this right here, this is a Z-A sound, Z-A. This is Gi. Now, what's interesting about this right here is that in our Achaz, the Achaz, or Achazoj, but the Achaz is how we define our ciphers, the ciphers, or our numbers, the ancient Ethiopic numbers. So when we count to 7, the number 7 looks like this. This would equal the number 7, or what we call Sebat. Sebat. Now, if we go into the Hebrew or the Hebraics, which is another Afro-Shemitic language, we have the Sheba. Some say Seba, as in Sheba, Sheba, and also means an oath. An oath or a covenant is considered the 7s. So this we find interesting because we have the Gi, this right here, Gi, Ge, Gu, Gi, Ga, Ge, Ge, Go, according to the 7 orders of the Ethiopic. So this will be Gi, Ze. Gi has a sound of Gi, and this has the sound of Ze. So together it would be Gize, as we would write it here, Gize. Now, the ancient Ethiopians, some of the first world peoples from the first time, are called the Agazi, the Agazi, the Agazi people, or the Ge'ez people. Now, this is a little bit linguistical. This part of the background of this particular subject to get to the real root is to deal with Ethiopic, the first language. Ethiopic, the first language. You have a new scribe, a new scroll coming out on entitled Ethiopic, the first language. And this we can say is coincidental, but it is about time. It's all about time. Because, see, if we don't understand time and what time is from what time is not. First of all, according to the present world that we live in, according to this Gentile world dominion, time is considered to be a lineal thing. a linear thing. What we mean is that it moves in a line. For example, if we look at time, we have, let us choose a particular time period. Let's begin with one of the first times, one of the interesting times that, according to this document and other documents right here, they say it began roughly around about 1890, when some of the aliens or extraterrestrials, or some might say the secret government, or the Greys, or the Pleiadians, depends on which particular sources you go to, even though much of it can be isolated to certain basics that appear to be true. So we'll begin with 1890. Let's go to 1890. We'll put 1890 right here, okay? And let us go to, say, 1990, right? And then let's go a little bit further, move this over, and we go to, what we'll say, 2010. And let's go a little bit further to 2020, and put a little mark here, roughly, for 2012, since that appears, if you can see this, that appears to be an important time. 2012 is an important time. Everybody's talking about this, and it is an important time. So we have 1890. They said that in 1890, some of these things, as we said, we're going to go in and mark some of the places off in this particular book where we were looking through it and scanning through it, and he said around 1890 is when they pointed as beginning, or at least this alien contact, or certain alien contact began to be resumed or begin. Now, for us in Rastafari Revelation, here it goes right here. It's on page 78. Shining the Light, ETs, Secret Government, and Alien Bases. They tell us that, just to share a little bit of this, it says, so it has the same optical illusion technology. We can't see it. The person reasoning with this being says, you can't see it, no. It's masked all the time. It can unmask if it is necessary to repair something, or if it's necessary to make a show of itself, but they haven't done it in the past 25 or 30 years. He's talking about certain satellites and some other space stations and some underground bases at the Horn of Africa and other places such as in South America. So the question is now asked, how long has it been there? How long has it been there? It's been there now about 105 years. It was not built by the people, you know, in the underground bases, by Earth people. It was built by the ETs and brought here and considered, well, I don't want to say a bribe, but let's say a gift. Then the question is asked, or the statement is made, but that's 1890. That's 1890. So I want you to keep that particular date in mind, because in 1892, the son of man, that child of humanity, Lij Teferi, would be born. And we're speaking about the one who we know as Haile Selassie I, but as that man-child, as Lij Teferi, would be born in 1892. So let's think about that particular date, with this particular date being mentioned here concerning the ETs, secret government, and alien bases. But that's 1890. So we're going back before what we had thought of as the beginning of the appearance of the UFOs. So what they're saying is that we're going back before what we had thought of as the beginning of the appearance. So there's a particular time when they say, well, the UFOs first began to appear. But here they're saying we're going back to the before the beginning of the appearance of the unidentified flying objects. So the answer is yes. It was brought here. It wasn't actually occupied by, let's call them, strategic forces of the earth until about 1943, 1944. But it was established in orbit, and those who brought it here established certain manufacturing capabilities when they were able to study the earth, trends on the earth, what would be needed and what they felt would be valued. They didn't put it all, they didn't put in all of the manufacturing. They put in some. And so they were doing that for several years, but it wasn't actually occupied by surface earth people of any form till the early to mid 40s. The early to mid 40s. So, see, we're pointing to these things because it's a significance. Half of the story has been not so much uncreated, but half of the story has been so cleverly and successfully suppressed from the record of history. And this is where we're going to point to how this has enabled them to, for lack of a better word, shift time, because time is not as linear as we would think. Time doesn't move in a line. Time actually moves in a cipher, or more of a spiral. You understand? More of a circle than a line. There's a linear dimension to time, but there's also a spiral dimension to time, a circular dimension. So the circle and the line together is what creates the spiral. I want you to understand that it may be a little bit complex at first. Well, not even complex, but a little out of the ordinary, because we've been told certain things. But what we're beginning to witness and what's registering in our heads and our heart is another reality that we haven't been told, but we're seeing that what we are experiencing is as real or even realer and more relevant than what we have been told. But what we have been told, they say, is the truth. And what we experience or feel or perceive, they tell us that's our own imagination. But what we're beginning to recognize is that what we feel or what we so-called imagine is becoming as real or realer than what they have told us, because they're going back on what they're saying and say, well, it's been believed these sort of things, but these new discoveries actually are turning upside down what has been believed to be the reality. So that means that many people have been believing lies, and this is why we're living in a very interesting time, quote, end quote. So anyway, 1890. So it's a further comment about 1890 is right here in the next question on page 78, where it says, so you're saying that before and during the Second World War, the shadow government and ET alliance was in effect? Oh yes, the answer is. It was actually in effect well before that. It started around the 1890s. What? That is not to say that the shadow government started then, but the shadow government and ET alliance started then. So something started roughly, they're telling us, something started roughly around the 1890s. The 1890s right here. Well, we know in 1892, let's make this 1892, that Lige Tafari was born in Ethiopia. We know that in 1896, Italy first attempted to invade and capture that godly, ancient, and holy land where the throne of David, the kingdom of David, was renewed. And we're speaking about Ethiopia. So let's recognize the significance. You understand? It wasn't just a little warfare. This was a European power decided to pick on a small African nation which has biblical and ancient claims, including the claim of the Ark of the Covenant. So now let's put this together. This is what we're saying. We have to put all of this together and reanalyze and weigh and balance what we have, right? So that's one of the points here. Now there's another point further on where it talks about controlled governments, some things going on the moon, some renegades, some other extraterrestrials or ETs or aliens, and they say right here on page 79, but they still controlled governments. The answer or the reply, they controlled governments and they had influence, although they were not 100% in control. They had about 80% control and were the significant influence in the U.S. government at that time, but they were not totally in control. They didn't have a totality of control. And what about the rest of the governments? Then it says, the U.S. government has always been a little easier to manipulate. But they had, at that time, in the 1890s, about 20% control in China. That is not to say that other people were manipulated in the government of were manipulated in the government in China, but that particular organization had about 20% control, 20% in China. They had about 3% in India, not much. They couldn't get a lot of control in India in the early days, which implies that they probably have more control today. And they had, let's see, where else would you be interested in? They had about 17% in France. Interestingly enough, France and India were the ones they had the most trouble with. India just has spirit energy, essentially, and it is hard for them to maintain control. Even to this day, they do not have 100% control in India. But France was also difficult because the people have an innate sense of going their own way, and this has benefited France greatly. At that time, they also had about 40% influence in Great Britain. In other words, speaking about this secret government or this alien influence. And so they had about 40% influence in Great Britain, which was a significant colonial power. Definitely Great Britain. So the connection they're making is with these regressive so-called fallen angels or aliens, and where they had particular control over the men and people. But then we found the next statement on page 79 of Shining the Light to be quite significant. This is book 1, Shining the Light, right? And it says right here, I thought the Americans were the free spirits. How did we become puppets? So this is the person talking for Split. I thought the Americans were free spirits. Then they say, how did we become puppets? Instead of says, I thought we were free spirits as Americans. When did we become puppets? So you see how some people talk with a split. In other words, I thought the Americans were the free spirits. How did we become puppets? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't know. But this is the key. Listen, simple. It says, as long as the white man has been here, this has always been a country in search of someone to look up to. It says, as long as the white man, the European, the Gentile, has been here, this has always been a country in search of someone to look up to. That is part of the reason that the Christian religion, let's say the Judeo-Christian, but primarily the Christian religion has taken root so strongly here, because the Christian religion by its very nature gives you more than one someone to look up to. There's someone for everyone in the family to look up to. It is less true with the Jewish religion, but it's there. The Buddhist religion has not taken over this country, and it never will. There will always be people who will follow it, but the Buddhist religion is not trying to give you leaders with absolute authority. It is trying to create a certain amount of autonomy in individuals. So I would say that this country has been ripe for manipulation since the arrival of the white man. Now, this is very key and significant. Now, would somebody call this book racist? Not generally necessarily. You probably haven't heard anything about this book being racist, but it's pointing out that the white man and manipulation go hand in hand. You understand? The white man or the European psychic. Now, remember what we said at the very beginning. We are living in what is known biblically as the times or the age of the Gentiles. So when the Bible talks about the end of the world, it's talking about the end of the Gentile world system. And this is why the economics and everything that's going on with the money throughout the world is in front and center of the news. Remember what the Bible says, that the love of money is the root of all evil. Think about it. Not money, but the love of money. So that connection also with the white man and the European economies and what has gone on in the earth over the past, say, 400, 500 plus years, round off to 2,000 years, right? Now, there's one more mention that we have right here of 1890. This is what we found to be very interesting, that the dates that it mentions here with certain purported alien activity, and then how these dates in Rastafari Revelation also overlap to significant events on the so-called proverbial other side of the world, or other side of the world system, the Ethiopian or the black man's, at the black man's root. In other words, that's part of the suppressed part. That part has been taken out of the context of the consciousness of humanity. And it's that sort of manipulation of the consciousness as well as the history, because if you're able to erase one's presence from history, you can also change time too. You know what I'm saying? In other words, if we can erase certain people out of the historical record, that also helps to change the perception of time. And this is part of what we were reasoning on First Light, that we found to be very interesting even to ourselves as we got into that particular discussion. So the person says, I understand an outside authority. I understand the response to the statement of the, I guess it's the alien or someone who has alien knowledge speaking, saying, so I would say that this country has been ripe for manipulation since the arrival of the white man, that the country we call America and the West and much of the world has been ripe for manipulation since the arrival of the white man. And then the response is, I understand an outside authority, which also shows that the white man or the European in the scheme of things is that part of that outside authority. This is why the Bible, when it talks about the end of the world, is really speaking about the end of the Gentile world dominion. And what's very key, and a lot of the preachers, your pastors, these other Bible folk who are putting out sign of the times CDs and end of the world, how to prepare, what's your future life going to look like, so forth and so on, most of them are avoiding the plain and the simple, what we call the peshat, the plain and the simple interpretation that when it's speaking about the end of the world, it's speaking about the Gentile world system, or what we call white supremacy. And see, this is not being racist. This is being accurate with history and accurate with the sociology as well as connecting it with Bible prophecy. But ask yourself, why all these Bible folks, I'm talking about the ones who really, these scholars and theologians, they understand what we're saying is correct. They cannot, deny it. They just try to circumvent it. They try to say that we're being racist when we're saying that the end of the world is connected with white supremacy, the Anglo-American European system of things is that system that God says will be the world system at the end, and when that ends, a new world order, a new system of God is to come into the effect. But they're fooling people. And see, this is all a part of the manipulation of the timeline. And that's what we want to discuss more on, the manipulation of the timeline. But right here, this other point is that, okay, I understand, an outside authority, right, for manipulation since the arrival of the white man, I understand, an outside authority. Okay. So there was on Earth a group in 1890 that made an alliance with just 8 or 9 renegades. Yes, the response is yes. And it's quite astonishing what can be done with automation. The response is yes, and it's astonishing what can be done with automation. Now think about it. We are living in this technological digital age when most of what we have, most of the internet and most of this technology we're using basically is a form of automation. So it's amazing what can be done with automation. When the renegades arrived, they weren't actually on that vehicle. They had that vehicle with the space manufacturing lab essentially in tow when they arrived. They arrived on a flying disc. But the 9 people working with about 180 androids, I'm loath again to use the word androids because they're more machine than flesh, but they are too advanced just to be called robots. They created much of the exotic machinery that still today is light years ahead of what can be produced even by the secret government. Of course, you can understand that a prize like this, a manufacturing facility that can produce things almost cosmically, is definitely valued. Now, like we said, there's much more to it, which some of it ones might say is speculative. Some might say, okay, this is almost science fiction, but think about it. The cell phones that people are using, if you go back to the old Star Trek series on TV, now people have come to accept that as being the fact, as being reality. But for a long time, people were saying, oh, this is hocus pocus, this is just fantasy. Somebody, Gene Roddenberry just imagining all of this. Did they imagine all of this? Think about it now. If you think about it now, the cell phones, the comlinks, and so forth and so on, even if you go back to some of the old Star Trek episodes, they actually tell you dates. They talk about, oh, this is Earth, or this is such and such a date. And what's very interesting is that we're close to that very date or these so-called timelines now, and we can see the fourth shadowing from the shadow, the fourth coming forth from the shadow of those same things right now. So you have to ask yourself, is this, some people say, is it reality imitating art? Is it art imitating reality? Or is it the manipulation of so-called time by the selective introduction of some information, the suppression of other information from the human consciousness, and creating what we've been experiencing for the past 40 or so years, a twilight zone? Humanity has been in a twilight zone. And if I share this particular portion of this with you, people will think, oh, you must be crazy. If I tell you that the so-called everything that we're experiencing now is really an illusion, people would say, you must be crazy. This is the real world. No, we're experiencing it. We've been in a twilight zone, a twilight zone for nearly 40 or so years, since the 60s. Many things ended. There's a whole different timeline, but the whole timeline, we're living in an altered reality. We're living in an altered consciousness. And some of y'all probably even know it. Some of y'all probably even feel it like, okay, well, yeah, you're doing what you got to do, but there is something that does not feel, that does not square with this present time. And some of the older folks, you see, the younger folks probably can't perceive it so much because, like His Majesty says, they lack wisdom because they lack experience. But some of the older folks actually know. Some of them, not all, but some of them are perceptive and wise enough and spiritually grounded enough to know that there is something not right with this present timeline that we're in, because some of them are old enough to how can you say, to experience real life, to know that we're living in something very, very artificial that's actually being created. In other words, we are creating, in a sense, or co-creating with the manipulation, this artificial timeline. That's why it's to ask yourself, how come nothing new? Really, think about it. Nothing new. People say, look at the computer, but that's not really new. When you understand the basis of technology, it's not really new. It's packaged differently. It's packaged anew, but it's not really new. Let's think about culturally. How come most of the cultural things always is reminding us of the 70s or the 60s or the 50s or the 40s? It's like we're in a consciousness loop. If you think about it, there hasn't been anything really new created for a while. In fact, when we think about the newest musical instrument, the only musical instrument that was created in the 20th century, that's the last century, the 1900s and everything, I think that's the steel drum. The steel drum is the only new musical instrument even created, and in a sense, it's not really new, but if we consider a new musical instrument, something that wasn't here in that form before, there you have it. So we're stuck in a loop. We're stuck in a loop. Now, about this particular timeline thing right here that we've been touching on, because it's not a subject matter that we really intended to really even touch on. It's just one of those things that you be thinking about, you be meditating, or the thought comes to your mind and you say, that's interesting. But then as you get more and more information along that particular line of thought, you sort of put it together and you say, wait, this is more than a coincidence. There is obviously something that's going on. Yes, time has been manipulated. You understand? Now, when we go a little bit further, and some of this is in this particular book right here, we find that they say, let's see, this is 1890, 1900s. We'll go to roughly about maybe right here, and we'll call this 1930. 1930, right? Because there are certain significant points along the present, in the present age. You see, in the Bible, we spoke about time as being a gizeh from the Amharic, the gizeh. Now, we could have also gone into a little more on the Agazi and on the Gu'ez and the first-time people. We could have also talked about the Gu'uz, the word Gu'uz from the Ethiopic. It means a neutrality, a neutral zone. And that is the connection with what we call this twilight. There's a twilight zone. Has this ever happened to you? Have you ever woke up right around well, you didn't know what time it was, but it seemed to be like around dawn. But then it could have been evening time, and you really wondered, like, wait, what time is it? And you looked at the time, it's like 6 o'clock, 6 something. And he said, wait, is it 6 a.m.? Or is it 6 p.m.? And you could not, I mean, you were looking at that reddish color. You understand? You was looking at even the feel of and you could not decide, you could not tell whether it was a.m. or p.m., whether it was going to become nighttime or whether it was going to become daytime. You're right between that. You're right between day and night, that twilight zone. Have you ever experienced that? I mean, I've experienced it a couple of times, and it's one of the most interesting feelings. It's almost an otherworldly feeling when you wake up right around twilight time, and you look at the time, and the time on the clock doesn't really help you. I mean, okay, it's about 6 o'clock, but then you look outside. Is it a.m. or p.m.? How long have I been sleeping? Have I slept through the night and this is morning? Or have I slept so long that it's going to turn night again? And you can't tell which way it's going to go. This is what we mean about the timeline being manipulated for the past 40 years, since the 60s. We are living in an artificial timeline, you understand, that has been created by certain regressive aliens. You want me to say it biblically? By certain demons, by the devil, by Satan, who knows that he has a short time. Therefore, he has been manipulating the consciousness of people by suppressing certain events and overemphasizing and even causing other traumatic events to cause, instead of it, really we're at the point of time, we're in the twilight zone time, but really it's dawn that is supposed to come up. It's a new day that was supposed to come up, but it doesn't seem like that. It doesn't feel like that. It's almost like we're going into the nighttime. So at that twilight time, this is where it can become an exhilarating, exciting, but it can also feel very scary, very, because you don't, is it nighttime or is it daytime? I don't know if it's night or day, and that is the point. That's where the humanity's consciousness is, because certain events have been, let's call it not uncreated, but let's call it they've been deflected. They've been deflected from their true historical importances. For example, Haile Selassie I, the truth of His Majesty, the truth of Ethiopia, even to a large extent the half of the story about black people, the real story about who we are, has been deflected so successfully that black people are still in this Martin Luther King civil rights loop until they don't even recognize the time after it. We have not gone to the time after Dr. King. We are still in this particular loop. And now people say, well, how have they done this? By manipulating the news, by manipulating the events, by manipulating even music. Music is a large part of it, because music affects our feelings and our emotions. And connecting certain music to certain historical events. I mean, if you think about it right now in a lot of advertisements, notice they're using a lot of dated music. They're not using new music. It's almost like there is no real new music. All the new music is trying to redo the old music. So you have to ask yourself, what has happened to creation? You see, what has happened to the creativeness of humanity? It is stuck in a twilight zone. Think about this for a moment. When that show came out, it was very significant. The whole twilight, I just hear the music right now, so forth and so on. But we're living in a twilight zone. Now, this date, 1930, And what they say in this particular series, I've heard it elsewhere, but you hear some things and it's like, okay, yeah, but you don't really put it together. But they say in 1930, a big ship came. What? A big ship, some alien UFO or some other big ship, mothership, came in the 1930s. Now, many thought that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was crazy. They thought that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was, because Elijah Muhammad was one that we as black folks who were, or whose people were into that, or passed on that knowledge to us, knew that the Nation of Islam, people thought they were crazy. They were talking about aliens, talking about mothership. There's a mothership up there, so forth and so on. And we were being told, and they were being told that you're crazy. There's no mothership. The space aliens is just science fiction. Now we learn, nearly 60 or so years later on, that in truth, in the 1930s, there was a mothership, or there was a big ship that came. Now think about this. 1930, November 2nd, 1930, the coronation of Haile Selassie upon the throne of David in Ethiopia. Now just think for a moment. That goes 180 degrees opposite of everything that the time of the Gentiles tell us. So in order to keep their time going, as it says in Genesis chapter 15, about the 400 years, you shall come out with great substance, but it says the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So even though the time has been fulfilled, there would be an undetermined amount of, quote, time that would elapse beyond the fulfilled time. Now, people say, well, the reason why the biblical writers wrote imprecise was because they couldn't write precise. No, they wrote very precise. Now we begin to understand how precise they actually wrote. So when people start to talk about, oh, the end of the world is going to happen at a certain day and hour, even the scripture says, don't believe it. Why? Because the end of this time, you see, the so-called quote, end quote time, has to do with the consciousness of humanity, the head and the heart of humanity. As long as people believe, you understand, or whose consciousness is caught in this psychic loop, it's a psychic loop that humanity is in. In fact, we have already come into the new age. There is already, the kingdom of heaven is already here. There is already a new heaven and a new earth here. But the problem is this, or the challenge is this, that most people can't accept it. They think that it's actually in another time. They think that they are in another time. You understand? So think about that for a moment. I know, like I said, I know this may sound a little bit science fiction or out there. You understand? But most, if they just be quiet and meditate, they will recognize they already have the evidence for most of what we're saying already in their heads and their hearts. But if they confess it, if they speak on it, somebody to the left or somebody to the right is going to say, you're crazy. You're crazy. That can't be true. You understand? But when you think about it, you'll know it. Anyway, a little bit more to come, brothers and sisters. Shalom. Rastafari. Stay tuned. Stay in tune.